I am now pleased to introduce Brendan Egan.
Seat is weird. Thanks a lot, Stacy. And thank everyone for coming out, and to the Arts and Humanities Council for having us here at Porch. Just so everyone knows, Alex, our instructor and mentor at McNeese, is having a reading tomorrow night. Where's it at, Alex?
Ralph Squire.
Ralph Squire is at an auditorium on campus at what time?
7.
At 7. So I'll be there. The story I'm going to read is called Man with Briefcase. The barber's body was curled up behind his own chair like a perfect sculpture of a body. The shallow dent behind the barber's ear was still sticky with blood, and so was the gash in the meat of his hand. And there was another wound somewhere that I couldn't see underneath the barber's white coat that was dribbling down his arm and across his wrist. The windows of the shop faced straight east, so that the sun reflected off all the big mirrors on the far wall and the chrome pedestals of the chairs and the glossy tiles of the floor. Where there should have been damp clips of hair were strokes of blood. There was a TV on somewhere turned up too loud. I held my hands over my ears, and I stood over the barber, waiting for my eyes to fix to the light, looking down the heavy marble shape of his skull. Lifelike is the wrong word, obviously, and I'm sorry to use it, but that was the effect. His eyes were like glazed glass. It was all very real, and I wasn't sure what I was expected to do. Before anything else, I felt unlucky. I had woken up early, unusual for me on a Saturday, and getting a haircut seemed like a good way to spend the morning. I have a nice set of clippers. Most of the time I give myself a trim on the first Saturday of the month. There's not much to cut these days, so it's relatively easy. But that Saturday I thought of going to the barber as a nice sort of change, a small kind of luxury. It had been such a long time since I had paid for a haircut that I wasn't sure where to go, or if there was a barber shop in my town at all. I remembered that there was an old-fashioned kind of place a few exits down the highway, in the town where a woman I used to see had lived. It had caught my eye because it had always seemed so neighborly, with a twirling pole and those large front windows that let you see in, to watch the barber lathering ointment on his palm and the customers draped with clean vestments. I may regret that my first reaction was to feel put upon by my circumstances. Certainly it does not reveal great empathy on my part, and if I were lying dead, in fact murdered, in my office, I would hope that the person who found my body would be at least pinched by horror or outrage or real sadness, or at least pity. But then I would also hope that I would not be found by a stranger at all. This is not the way we think of it. It's almost always in bed, isn't it? With a consoling palm on our forehead. And if our body must be discovered dead, it is by someone who has loved the sight of us living for so long that finding us any other way is inconceivable. Anyhow, I had the sense that it was not my place to have walked into the barber shop that morning. I assumed the man deserved better. I should have been in my bathroom, leveling up my sideburns, then wiping clean the bowl of my sink. It was less alarming than you might imagine, touching the vein under his neck. The stillness was a kind of relief. I realized that if there had been even the smallest stirring there, I would have been obligated to try and save him. And I imagined bungling through my disheveled memory of first aid brochures and paramedics in movies. How many pumps? How many breaths? And then, with a life in my hands. I was nearly glad, I suppose, that he was too far gone for all of that. It was only the temperature that really bothered me. The barber's skin was about as warm as an hour-old bath. With my fingers below his chin, I thought I could feel the heat still leaving. When we watch the news at night, it seems so simple to act out of goodness, and simpler still to identify it. Some days I've even wished to be present in a tragedy for the chance to be decent, to demonstrate character. I'm not looking for you to sympathize with me, but I do hope that you'll allow me to go on. It's difficult to find someone who will listen. As I said, the volume of the television was deafening. It was installed high up on a bracket in the far corner of the room. One of the morning shows was on, and they had gotten to the segment where the guest chef demonstrates a favorite recipe. I realized that the television was out of my reach, and I began to look for the remote. It seemed important that the room be absolutely quiet, so that I could call 911. Though in retrospect, I could have easily gone outside. For whatever reason, it didn't occur to me then. I scanned the bank of countertops and the floor, but couldn't find the remote. On the morning show, the chef began preparing a type of fudge brownies that somehow incorporated bacon. The incessant sizzling of a griddle filled the room, and the hostess of the morning show, who I remember wore a trim purple blazer, hummed a little lasciviously at the chef. I finally found the remote beside the open closet, stuck to the door jamb with Velcro tape. It was in a place that could only have seemed obvious to the person that put it there. The dispatcher had a calming voice, and I wondered if she was aware of it. "Are you in the building now, sir?" she asked. I felt my shoulders loosening as I listened to her, as if her very words were rubbing deep into my muscles. It didn't seem likely that she always spoke this way, therapeutically, but it was possible. I considered what life must have been like for her, if her voice had always been smooth and strong, and it pleased me to think that maybe she had found an occupation that so well suited her gift. "Sir, are you sure that you're not in danger?" "Danger?" I said. "Are you positive that you're alone?" she said. I looked at the barber. From where I was standing, I couldn't see his face. He could have been anybody. "I'm fine," I said. The dispatcher told me the police and the EMTs were on their way and that I should wait outside. "Of course," I said, but I went nowhere. I examined the things on each of the narrow counters. There were 3 of them, and 3 mirrors, and 3 mottled beige chairs, pleather we used to call it. The stations were each individualized, it seemed, by the accretion of items, small enough to fit in that limited space. There were bright, bird-headed spray bottles, slick stacks of magazines, a flowering cactus in a tiny pot, business cards stuck into the bevel of the mirror. It struck me how each was like a diorama of a distinct career, a life, and there were pictures alongside the business cards and in frames, which gave each a face. The station nearest the front of the shop belonged to the barber, my barber, now lying behind me on the floor. I spotted his face in one photograph, his skin toast brown, Mediterranean maybe, and well wrinkled around the mouth. 2 young women stood at his side, both a head taller than him, both wearing the kind of summer dresses that make you think of long grass and the ocean. Daughters, I thought. The picture made me wish that I had known the man. He appeared pleasant. Probably he had developed a slightly exasperated sense of humor, the product of a life where everything seemed to change except this chair, the mirror. "These politicians are something else, huh? Next thing you know, we'll all be like Dick Tracy talking into our watches. These daughters of mine, I tell you what." I've never had a barber, or a grocer, or even a package store clerk who always kept a pack of my favorite beer in the cooler. I could not pick my mailman out of a lineup. He is always delivered while I'm at work. My father, I remember, went to a barber named Robinson. Robinson's barber shop was in the city, New York, where my father worked and kept a small apartment. I was never sure if Robinson was his first or last name, only that my father would come home on the train and my mother would smile and run her fingers over his smooth chin or through his hair, and my father would say that he had been to Robinson's that afternoon. It was a name from his other world, the one where he spent 4 nights of every week for at least a half dozen years of my childhood. Once, I was around 13, I guess, so this was in the big house on Brookwater, though really it might have been anywhere. It was one of those memories that seems bleached of everything except the very kernel of it. Well, one night I came down the stairs of this house. My mother was shouting at my father again, and I heard them through the floors. I was going to say that I wanted a drink of water, the way that a child does, though he knows very well that there are paper cups in the bathroom and a sink. But I didn't say to them that I was thirsty. I was 13 and convinced that I was not a child. I just stood there silently for a moment, with my shoulders straight, staring them in the face to show them that I was a person too, living in their house, and that I knew that life was not perfect. And for that moment I believed that I was truly being seen, that in the sudden quiet my parents acknowledged that I was not totally innocent of anger or resentment. And I was satisfied with this result, and I wanted to leave them there, stewing in their realization. But when I turned to go up the stairs, my father ruined the silence and said, with mock joviality, "Really, honey, really, Robinson does the zaniest impressions you ever heard. You should just hear his Donald Duck. I don't do it right at all." The whole memory was in that name, Robinson. It came back to me as I stood in the barber shop, alone, the way religion does for some, the entire mystery emerging from the name. For all the things that had been knocked onto the floor, I was surprised to see the jar, filled with stainless instruments, soaking in blue barbicide, still upright. I lifted the lid of the jar. It seemed a strange shame to me. For all the sharp blades and points in the room, the barber's attacker had used something brutally blunt, and I was afraid that the barber had not reached for his tools, which surely fit his hands like the teeth in his mouth, and he must have gone slowly, but without any struggle. There was a straight razor there between two combs. I reached into the jar. The razor was not beautiful, but it had a kind of steely weight. I fished it out and put it in my pocket. The police asked me questions, of course, and I answered them when I could. One of the detectives seemed disappointed in me. He looked in many ways like myself, only handsomer, with a more pronounced chin and a sharper nose. It's possible that was his trouble with me. In looking at me, he saw a distorted version of himself and began to wonder if others saw him that way, looking like me on me. "So you're not a regular customer, is what you're telling me," the detective said. "Not at all," I said. "I mean, I'm not." "So where is it that you usually get a haircut?" "Usually I cut my own hair. I mean, I stay at home," I said. That seemed to make him happy. "I see," he said. He must have not thought much of my hairstyle. I didn't have a reason for taking the razor. This may be difficult for you to believe, but it was a completely indifferent act. As thoughtless as walking away with a cashier's pen or a cigarette lighter. Not that I find it to be an excuse for robbing the barber, much less an example of desirable behavior. I found out later that the man who killed the barber had taken only $70, and I felt that in some ways I had walked off with the greater spoils. I would have liked to think that I was a better man than that, but once I had walked out the door of the shop, the razor was mine. Talking with the police officers, I had been annoyed by the barber's pole, that it continued spinning, driving its helix of red always madly upward. Made me feel a disproportionate sense of injustice, as if the death of the man inside should have ceased its idiotic movement, the way we dip flags at the death of a soldier or statesman. But I knew that despite the loss, the pole would persist in twirling, the sign of the ancient surgeon bringing its ribbons of blood. On the way home, I drove for 3/4 of an hour before I realized I had missed my exit. I wasn't thinking about the barber or the razor anymore. I was thinking about my father. He spent so little time in our house, mine and my mother's, as I saw it. And yet, when he was there, I was expected to ask if he were my supreme authority. My shoes would have to be polished, the corners of my sheets tucked in, my fingernails cleaned and trimmed. My homework was checked for penmanship, though I'm sure it was never read. And I was expected to make no plans on the weekends because my father, for 2 days a week, would not be seen without his family, whose apparent contentment in his company earned him a reputation throughout Thames, Connecticut, as a man of estimable values. As I turned to go back up the stairs that night that I had first decided to not pretend anything anymore, I had expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I was confused by the thin charade my father made of relaying jokes, dredging up this old character, Robinson the barber. It wasn't that night, but over time I came to feel less anger than disregard. I came to thinking of my father and all his stale habits as ridiculous. His dry cocktails and gray suits, even his hair slightly oiled and parted far to the side, were pathetic remnants of a world that was too old, even for him. I carried this attitude around through high school and college, and eventually became tired even of my own sneering. For the last 20 years, all thoughts of my father moved in the same instantaneous spiral: anger, derision, exhaustion. I turned the car around in a dry cleaner's parking lot and drove home, where I slept without any dreams for the next 16 hours. As I was getting ready for work on Monday, it occurred to me that I might use the barber's razor to shave. I washed my face with hot water and then lathered up my chin without much hesitation. It felt like the most natural thing to do, but then I had the razor open in my hand, the heavy bladed arm of it balanced against one finger. I took one slow stroke down the side of my cheek and immediately nicked the skin at the corner of my jaw. I rinsed off the blade and flipped it shut. I had not the first clue how to use it, and I would have surely butchered myself if I had tried to learn. It seems now a terribly dramatic gesture. An article about the barber was on the front page of the paper that morning. The police had still been unable to find the killer, but were working diligently. The mayor issued a statement about continued vigilance in the face of rampant crime. The neighbors were terrified. They blamed drugs and poverty and the weakness of the people who were supposed to protect them. No one blamed themselves. Not that I expected them to, and not because I think that the neighbors were at fault per se, but this sort of event has always provoked a feeling in me that the roots of tragedy are spread wide. Maybe it is a kind of defense, but I find myself asking, isn't there something that all of us should have done? There was also an announcement there in the paper for a memorial service to be held at a Baptist church. I wondered if anyone in attendance would feel, at least in part, responsible. I was worried by the article's open-endedness. Specifically, I wondered if my taking the razor might make it appear as if I had killed the barber. A part of me waited for the detective, the one who looked so much like myself, to call and tell me that he had dusted for prints and found mine smudged onto the lid of the barbicide jar. Was there anything I'd like to tell him? Rationally, I questioned if anyone in fact dusted for anything anymore, or if that was only the way police operated on television. I got very little work done. I regretted leaving the razor so openly displayed on the soap dish above my sink. That evening, I thought of ways that I might get rid of the razor. I first thought of simply throwing it in the trash can at the end of my driveway, but I became consumed by the panicking possibility that someone might be watching me from an unmarked patrol car parked a few houses away. I considered driving downtown and dropping the razor through the grate of a storm drain or into the river, but I imagined how suspicious I might appear if this undercover police officer had seen me driving along the road to the state pier. And then I thought of giving up, of calling the police myself and telling them what happened, trying to explain that it was all an innocent mistake. But that was exactly the problem. I didn't feel innocent. I felt as if I had done something grievous, and simply disposing the evidence of my crime wasn't the solution I was looking for. I was not unaware of the paranoia these notions betrayed. I wandered through my house and reassured myself that there was nothing to worry about. No matter how I tried to escape it, though, my restlessness got the better of me. After an hour, I snatched up my keys and left with the hope that a meal from the Olympia Pizza House would finally keep my mind from whirling. The trouble, I think, was that the Olympia was a busier restaurant than I'd remembered. The waitress, a curt and ruggedly pretty woman with a thick, orangish ponytail, showed me to a table near the front, then vanished into the kitchen through a swinging door. I thought we might have gone to high school together. My mind wandered through the garbled conversation of a dozen or so families and couples surrounding me, grazing over their dense, oily pizza crusts and pitchers of beer. I listened to the points of their silverware chirping on their plates. It was all impenetrable language. My eyes scanned up and down the blue Corinthian columns printed on the menu, but I couldn't focus on the words and prices there. I knew that it was unwise, but I had brought the razor with me, and I absently toyed with it beneath the table. "Know what you like?" the waitress said. I had noticed her approach the table, and her speaking startled me. "I haven't been here in a while," I said. "Everything's still the same, probably," she said. "When were you here the last time?" And I had to think about it. I felt as if I hadn't been out to eat in months. I looked up at her. The waitress's carroty hair was glowing from the soft dome lamp of the restaurant. She appeared almost haloed, and her head was framed by a poster of the Acropolis or some other terrific ruin which hung on the wall. The effect was uncanny. Not only did it create the illusion, however briefly, that she was placed there like some Delphic vision before a crumbling monument, but also there was the nagging familiarity I felt towards her, as if we should have been friends. "Do we know each other?" I asked. "From school, maybe? Thames High School?" She cocked her head at me and narrowed her eyes, either ruining the mythic illusion, I thought, or else elaborating upon it, now portraying the scorning and wrathful goddess. I touched my thumbs to the blade of the razor. I couldn't decide. "I'll have the antipasto," I told her. She scribbled down the order and spun away from me without asking whether I'd like something to drink. She was obviously flustered and fumbled trying to put her pad and pen back into the pocket of her apron, and in her rushed retreat to the kitchen, a few loose bills from what I assumed to be her tip money fluttered to the ground behind her. "Miss," I said, but she did not turn back. I stood up from my seat and picked up the money. I caught up with her and tapped her on the shoulder and tried to tell her that she had dropped the bills, but the waitress flinched at my touch. "Hey, man," she said, turning to me with her hair nearly flaming in its orangeness. "Hey, why don't you go sit down, huh?" Her eyes were steaming with that particular rage that boils out of fear. I tried to say I was sorry, but that I was only trying to help. I held out the money in my fist. "That's my tips," she said. "What's wrong with you?" She was very loud now, and the conversations around us had gone quiet. A young man in a long blue apron, a cook, came out from the kitchen before I could explain. He stepped in front of the waitress. "Sir," he said, "sir, have a seat, why don't you?" "No," I said, "I've done nothing wrong." I said, I shook the money now. I could not understand why it had become so difficult to do such a simple favor. "Am I going to have to ask you to leave, sir?" I rapped the money against my forehead in a demented gesture of frustration. I realized then that I was still holding the razor tight against the palm of my other hand. I felt the possibility of its blade in my mouth, its straightness, its sharpness, its weight. I felt as if I could cut right through the silence in that moment. I could slice into it, cleaving the solid stares of the quiet eaters huddled over their crusts. All it would take was a single swift rip of fingers and wrist. I knew it like a familiar taste. "No," I said to the cook. "No, you don't have to ask me to leave." I dropped the money back on the floor where I had found it. When I got home, I was shaking badly. I was no longer hungry, but I poured myself a drink of cold gin and sat on the couch. After a while, I called my father. He was surprised at first. Other than a handful of trips I had made down to see him and my mother, since they moved to Florida, I hadn't spoken to him except on Christmas and his birthday. "What are you up to?" I said, and he picked up. "It's about 10 o'clock here. What time is it there?" No matter how many times I explained to him that the time zones ran east to west, he always thought that it should be earlier in the day, wherever I was. "It's the same here, Dad," I said, "just like when you lived here." "Well, it's about 10 where I am, and I'm going to watch the news on TV." I hadn't watched any television in the last few days, and the thought of the hostess in the purple jacket and a phantom smell of bacon leapt into my head and made me feel a little bit weak. "Where's Mom?" I asked. "She's out with the girls. They play that game, that Chinese game there. Mahjong," I said. "It goes till late," he said. I told him about the barber and feeling strange about it, but I left out the bit about remembering him and about the razor and the disaster at the Olympus Pizza House. For a little while, he was quiet. I saw a dead horse once, he said, in the city. A horse I thought was not the same, really, but I listened anyhow. And he told me about finding on the road that looped about the reservoir in Central Park. He'd been walking on a lunch break, it seemed, and it was winter. He was alone. There were many small puddles in the road that had frozen solid through to the earth. He thought that the horse might have slipped on one of these patches of ice, slipped and fallen and broken something vital. There was no rider or driver to be seen. This logic of the ice as cause of death struck me as far-fetched, but he began to describe the horse. There was a searching note in his voice that I had only rarely heard before, and so I let him continue. There's only the horse and I, he said. He was enormous and copper-colored, but not copper like a copper wire, copper like an old penny, or like a wavy-haired girl, like that. The tail on him, it was feet long and so soft, I almost had to touch it. It was a damn cold day. After a while, there were lots of people there, my father told me, but none of them seemed to know whose horse it was or exactly how the incident had occurred. They only saw that the horse was no longer breathing, that someone would need to be called to move the body out of the way. After he said this, he stopped speaking. On the phone, I heard not quiet exactly, but the unsettling hiss of absence, distorted over miles of wires and through the vacant beaming of satellites. What did you think about it? I said. I mean, how did you feel? Of course, I felt bad for the guy whose horse it was, but you know, it was an accident. Most bad things are. Sure, I said, though I was not sure at all about this belief. Then he came back finally, this guy who owned the horse, told everyone to shoot. Away, he said. Who was he? I asked. To be honest with you, my father said, I thought the guy was asking for it. In a way, he had on these bad brown shoes, the kind with flat soles. Slick as a slice of pastrami, this guy's shoes. What do you mean? I said. You can't walk on an icy road with shoes like that. You're just asking to crack your head. But he wasn't one that fell. Same difference, he said. He went on again, and I sensed a change in his voice, some crick of doubt, and he said that he stayed there, even after the other pedestrians had left. He'd felt drawn to the body of the horse, large as it was and so strange in the cold. He tried to describe the way the steam had lifted through its skin, its coat, a column of steam that was thick in the light and turned by the wind. But I didn't want to see it that way, my father said to me. You understand, he wouldn't allow himself the thought of a body being any more than a body. And so then he was quiet. I told my father I'd call back to talk to my mother, and I thanked him. You still talk to that girl there? The blonde you brought down? He said before I hung up the phone. We email, I said. That's too bad, he said. Your mother liked her. I went to the Baptist church, a building I'd passed about 100 times before, but had never bothered to imagine the insides of. With my best suit on and the razor settled to my breast pocket, I sat in a pew at the very back. I spent the entire ceremony looking over the place. It was white and square, very plain except the ceiling, which was also tiled white, but embossed with a floral pattern that wove through, tile to tile, with an infinite strand of stems and vines. I found the barber's 2 tall daughters up front wearing black dresses and cardigans. One of them wore a hat. They sat next to a very small woman who wore a dark gray shawl. Their mother, I guess, the barber's wife. The ceremony had a few songs accompanied by an electric organ, and some people spoke. I couldn't focus on anything that was going on. I reached into my pocket and ran my thumb over the razor there, the ridge of its arm. When the ceremony was over, I made my way into a line of people who went up to the altar. The line moved slowly, and I kept my head down. I didn't want to be noticed. There was a photograph on the altar, a picture of the barber that could have been taken the same day as the one I had seen on his small counter at the shop. Around the picture, people left flowers and other photos. Some people left mementos. I'd hoped for something like this. It was my plan to leave the razor there, to give it back to the barber, and not need to carry it around anymore with a feeling of guilt on it. I arrived at the front of the line and I kneeled down like I'd seen the people in front of me do, and I rested there for a second. I thought maybe I would feel something, an acknowledgement. I pulled out the razor and squeezed it in my hand, and then I got up. In the same way that I took it the first time, I kept it in my hand then, as if I'd just forgotten what I intended to do. I walked away from the altar a little bit dizzy, nearly turned around to go back, but there was someone new kneeling there. I had nowhere to go. I was frozen. I walked quickly outside as soon as I got my bearings. It was a warm, damp night, like I was living inside a human breath. I tried to think of what had happened, of what to do. I squeezed the razor so hard it seemed I could have split the handle in half and gouged my palm. Now it was truly mine. Then I saw the widow. She was standing at a side door, the one that led to the fellowship hall, I figured. She was alone and seemed not to be looking at anything at all. She wasn't crying or even visibly sad. She was blank of anything like emotion. I walked over to her and asked if she was all right. Yes, she said, thought I could use a little air conditioning. Then I said nothing. I wasn't sure what I thought I would do. Were you one of Sally's customers, she asked. I haven't seen you before. She looked at me in a way that made it clear she had no idea why I should be there and why I should approach her this way. No, I said. And then just after, he was a friend of mine. Just half a lie at first. He was a kind and loving friend. Everyone will miss him, I'm sorry. What happened makes me feel very sad. I hadn't planned to say it, and really until that moment it hadn't been true, but for just a second I felt my eyes starting to swell. When I arrived home, I placed the razor in this briefcase, the one I still carry today. I hope that you'll understand, and if not understand, then excuse, why I've kept a dead stranger's straight razor, a man who I cannot claim to honor by the keeping. It fits well in a narrow leather pocket here, next to my pens and the folder of photos and the odd business card. I can't say that really it holds any emotional weight, except by extension, but I feel it there as I walk up the pathway to my front door at night, the slight weight of it like an organ set beneath the ribs. I keep it with me to fight off the thoughts of being found alone and unarmed. Thanks a lot.
Thank y'all so much for coming out. Let's give it once more for Lynn and Stacy. We have a regular reading series here at the Porch on the first Friday of each month, so make sure to come back next month. And at 9 o'clock, Mike Zito is going to start playing, so make sure to stick around. Thanks.